Hello and welcome to a quick overview lesson on the Sonata Form. Today's lesson will be a general summary of the form and what to look for. I will also do a quick analysis of two pieces, one elementary and one advanced, and hopefully I'll finish all of these within 20 minutes. So feel free to ask or send questions, and if you need more individualized lessons with your Sonata questions, you can see the website on screen and also in the description later on. And that's where you can get in touch with me. Great. So let's get started. So as mentioned, we are talking about the sonata form today. And obviously it applies to sonatas, but also to sonatinas. Many people start learning with sonatinas rather than sonatas. And a sonatina basically just means a small sonata, a smaller scale sonata. And a sonata by itself, in its original meaning, it means a piece written for instruments as opposed to something written for singers. And form means structure. It is how a piece is constructed. And there are some other examples of forms that you may have heard of before, like the binary form AB, the ternary form ABA, the rondo form ABACA. So we're only going to be talking about the sonata form today, which is kind of like a rounded binary form. Now, the sonata form itself is a very specific way to organize the piece. It was very popular in the classical period and later on as well. And it was used in a lot of different kinds of pieces, obviously for your instrumental sonatas, but also chamber music like trios, quartets, symphonies, and concertos. And all of these pieces that use sonata forms, there is very little differences between them. And the sonata form is built upon a very important principle about two contrasting ideas that will be presented, transformed, and then at the end of the piece reconciled. And it is usually in three distinct sections. Now, I say usually because form is not a formula that people follow. Rather, it is a structure that we find in many, many pieces. And of course, some composers being a little bit more creative or wanting to try new things may do some differences. So in any case, usually the sonata form will have two contrasting ideas presented in three distinct sections. The first is the exposition. The second is called the development. And finally, we have the recapitulation, or for short, we say recap. Sometimes there is an introduction at the beginning of the piece or a little coda at the end of the piece. So let's move on quickly to look at the exposition, the very first section of the piece, which is usually at the beginning. Now, in the exposition, two contrasting ideas or themes will be presented. You will hear them very quickly in the beginning of the piece. And these two ideas are usually in two different keys. They may be, if you're in a major key, the first theme may be in tonic, and the second theme may be in the dominant key. Or sometimes if you're in a minor key, the second theme will come out in its relative major. And so the key is one way the two ideas are contrasting, and of course there are also other ways of contrasting, and we'll talk about them later on in the lesson. Okay, so this is a brief outline of what the section will look like. You have a first theme, you have a transition, you have a second theme, and then you have a codetta, which is like a small coda at the end of the exposition, and then this will be repeated. So let's take a look at a very simple sonata Clementi's Opus 36 number 1, which a lot of you may have heard before. So looking at this is a piece that is in C major. We see that there is no key signature, and so we expect the first theme to show up in C major. And so we start with the first theme. And then it goes on from there. Now, where we start the transition is actually quite clear in this piece. As the F sharps start to appear, we can safely assume that the transition has already begun, because remember, our second theme is usually in a different key. And so our transition needs to get us to the new key. And so to find where the transition is, sometimes we look for logical places like the beginning of a phrase. So I'd like to put the transition right there, where it starts moving. And then right here, we see the G major scale in measure 8. And that is where we know that, okay, we are definitely in a new key. So moving on, this leads us to the second theme. It's clearly in G major now. You see all the F sharps coming in, and this section also ends in a G major chord. The repeat sign is a good indication of the end of the exposition. Most composers will put a repeat sign, and you will repeat when you perform the exposition. And of course, the key is not the only thing that is different about the second theme. Okay, I'm going to put up both themes side by side so we can take a look. Now, the material for both themes are completely different. The first theme is more of this kind of chordal thing. And the second theme is a little bit different. We have this wide leap and scales. And you have this Alberti bass in the second theme, which you don't see in the first theme. It's a more sparse kind of accompaniment in the left hand. So, of course, there are differences, there are similarities, but using all these different clues, we can easily identify the first and second theme in a piece. Okay, of course, there might be other differences like character, the pace of the notes, dynamic changes, and so on. All right, so we've gone through the exposition, and so the next section will be the development. Okay, let's see what that looks like. So in the development, what we have is that the existing material will be transformed in a variety of ways, and different keys will show up as well. And some of the keywords you'll want to look at are listed here. So motif, or a musical idea, is something that we want to think about. We find the motifs in our themes and then how they are being transformed. Inversion, how we flip things around. Diminution, shorten it. Augmentation, lengthening it. Sequence, taking something and repeating them in sequence. Modulation, extension, and so on. These are all terms that you can use to describe what happens in your development. So in this sonatina's development, we have our first and second theme on the left. When we look at the development, immediately we can see that, okay, that right there is material from the first theme. And of course it is different now because we are not in C major anymore. We are in a somewhat minor kind of mode as well. And if you take a look at the end of the first line, where I just put this circle here where the left hand goes, doesn't it kind of sound like your second theme, but backwards? So stuff like this. So of course this is a sonatina. It's very, very small scale. It's very short, and there isn't a lot to talk about. But already here you can see how Clementi has developed or edited this material from the first and second theme in this development. Okay. So now after we change all these, we make all these changes, we have to come back and remind people what the themes are. So we get back to the recap. And the recap really is a repeat of the exposition, but it is slightly different because both themes now are in the tonic key. We are coming to the end of the piece. We want to stay in our home key. So again, we have our first theme. Our transition doesn't stay the same because we don't have to go to a new key. We have our second theme still in tonic, and we have our cordata to come to the end of the piece. So let's take a look at what this looks like in the sonatina. So you can see that the first theme is now in a lower octave. It's different, and sometimes, and it's okay to do that. Sometimes that changes. Oops, sorry. But for the most part, the first theme stays pretty much intact, and you can see that there are no more F sharps. The transition doesn't really go to another key either. And here in the second theme, it is clearly in C major. We see the C major chord at the end. The whole thing is in all white keys, so it's in C major. We can recognize the second theme material, but we no longer are in a different key. So in short, this is your sonata form. This slide I've shown before, your principle, two contrasting ideas in three sections. How it's presented is transformed and reconciled. Okay, so before we move on to look at a different piece, some other points that we want to think about as we move into later classical periods and sonatas rather than sonatinas. Okay, things may be less clear as composers become more experimental in their techniques. So there are some of these things that might show up that make our sonatas a little bit different from a standard form. Sometimes there is no development, and that is fine. Sometimes there is no second theme in the recapitulation. Sometimes there are more than two themes. Sometimes there are different keys. Beethoven likes using the third instead of the dominant. Sometimes there are fewer than two themes. Sometimes there's an introduction and a coda. And as long as we remember what our principle is, the two contrasting ideas, and usually two contrasting keys, we can identify all our sections in a sonata form. Now, before we move on to a more advanced piece, we also have to think a little bit about cadences, which are like our punctuation in music. Stuff like an authentic cadence or perfect cadence, or a half cadence, something that sounds incomplete. And why we need to know these is because these are very clear indications of when things happen, when sections change, when new material is introduced, and we will see that in our next piece. So something very different from what we had before, but we're going to jump right into Beethoven's Sonata in F minor, Opus 2, number 1. And I don't have time to go into an in-depth discussion of this, but we can always talk about that later on. So in the very beginning, there's no introduction. We jump right into the first theme. And we can hear the F minor arpeggio very clearly. This is our first theme, the pause indicating when it ends. We'll stop there. And immediately after that, we have the transition. And you can see that by here, Beethoven has already started developing his materials. Both the arpeggio kind of idea is already changing. We're in a different key now. And also this little motif, the turn motif, he's using it to do. So these are all clues that we know, so that we know that we are no longer in our first theme. We're moving away from the first theme. Okay, so let's moving on to the next part of the piece. So we're expecting to find our second theme, and it should be very contrasting. And as we are in the minor key, we're going to expect it to be in our relative major, which is A flat major. Thankfully, Beethoven does do A flat major, but our new theme, which is right here, it starts there. doesn't really sound like A flat major. But if you know your cadences, you will be able to find that A flat major chord right there and be able to identify that because of this 5 in your left hand. So it's very concealed. It doesn't even sound like A flat major yet. But we can go ahead and identify this as our second theme because of how different it is as opposed to our, and how we really move on to an A flat major chord right there already. Okay, it doesn't really sound like it, but as we keep going, a few more bars down, we finally get to our clear A flat major scale. So using a combination of harmony and of thematic knowledge, we see all these clues to identify the section. Now, where does this end? Again, we look for our 5-1. And so, at the ending of this second theme, we have what we call the codetta, a little closing section. And here it's something that sounds completely different. So even without Beethoven clearly telling us what's happening here, what's happening there, with all these clues in the music, we can identify our section. And also, the end of the exposition comes up because we have the repeat sign at the end. So what comes after the exposition? We have the development. Okay, clearly we are starting at A flat major. And we start with, this is our first theme material. Okay, we can see all our motifs that we need. So let me put up the first and second theme on the screen so that we can kind of see it. Maybe? There you go. Okay, so you can see the first theme on the top left hand of the screen, second theme at the bottom of the screen. Now, there's some techniques we can talk about already, like an extension. You see how he adds one more measure in that first theme material. Stuff like that happens. And then the second theme material is pretty much standard. Of course, we're in a different key. We're in B flat minor, but that's fine because the development doesn't really have a key to base on. It goes from one to another, and that's why it's called the development. If we look on a little bit further on in the piece, there's an inversion of sorts where the left hand takes the melodies this time of the second theme. So things like this, and you can go through the development and find all of these little things that Beethoven has done. He will also shorten the second theme and go to a few more different keys before we get to the recapitulation. So getting to the end of this development is not as clear where it ends, but it's very clear where the recap begins because it sounds just like the beginning without the pickup note this time. Okay, now before we get there, there is a clue that appears in many longer sonatas that tells us where this recap starts, and this is what we call a retransition. A retransition is a dominant preparation, C being the dominant of F minor. You can hear it. There's a pad over here. And what this does is that after a very turbulent development, the more turbulent your development, the more important this dominant retransition is, because it prepares the listener for the recap. And this is, of course, another harmonic clue we can use to find our landmark sections. So we get into the recap now. I was just pointing out all these little motifs, turn motifs that he's using all over the place. All right, we get back into the recap, very straightforward. on the left it's the exposition, on the right it's the recap of the first theme. There are some more changes to the left hand. Our first theme is here. And we can see that we no longer need a different transition. So our transition is back in F minor this time. Right, so little changes here and there. Our left hand changes. And so we know that this is, if you just listen to the two sections back to back, we know that they are similar, but not exactly the same. Similarly, for the second theme, the key is different. We're going to stay in F minor this time instead of major. We're staying F minor. But the rest of it sounds pretty much standard. It keeps going, it keeps going. And then at the end of the second theme, at the end of the scales, we come to our cordata. And obviously we are in F minor. But this time we get something a little bit longer because even if you count the number of measures in the exposition, we only have 7.5 measures of this cordata. And here in the development, in the recap, we have obviously more. With 12.5 measures, he has an additional 5 bars, which we can also safely call the coda, which is the closing of the entire piece. It's not completely new material, but it's not something that we have heard before. So that brings us to the end, and that is very quickly what I like to call a quick and dirty explanation of what sonata form is. So let me put the screen back up, and at this point, if you have any questions, you can put it in the chat. You can send me an email, and I will be ending the lesson right about now. And I hope to see you all again soon.